This film spent 2 hours earning every ounce of pain, then threw away the hardest truth in a single scene.
Spoilers ahead. I Swear opens at the end. A man walks up to receive an honor from the Queen. He's shaking slightly, and before he can say a word, an involuntary obscenity fills the room. Nobody around him reacts with shock. The audience at home doesn't know what to do with it yet, but director Kirk Jones knows exactly what he's doing. He's showing you the conclusion before the argument, because the power of this story isn't in whether John Davidson survives. It's in understanding what he survived, and why most of it never had to happen. John Davidson was 12 years old when his tics started. Before that, he was the kid everyone wanted around, a goalkeeper, funny, comfortable in his own skin in the way only children who haven't been broken yet can be. Then came the involuntary sounds, then the uncontrollable movements, then the words, crude, shopping, unstoppable, pulled out of him by a condition that wouldn't be properly identified in his world for years. Coprolalia, the clinical term for involuntary obscene speech, is one of the most visible and least understood symptoms of Tourette syndrome, and in 1980 Scott All.
What makes the film's construction so sharp is that it never positions Tourette syndrome as the enemy. The condition doesn't ruin John's life. People do. His teachers interpret involuntary outbursts as deliberate rebellion and respond with corporal punishment, the belt across the hands, a practice still legal at the time. His classmates pull away. His father, overwhelmed by a situation he can't fix, eventually leaves. And his mother, Heather, caught between love and helplessness, begins separating John from the rest of the family at mealtimes. She puts him in front of the fireplace, alone, while the rest of the family eats together in the next room. That single image carries more psychological weight than any diagnosis scene ever could, because it tells you something the film never says out loud. John's deepest wound isn't the tics, it's the exile, the systematic removal of belonging by the people who were supposed to provide it. And here's where Jones's structural gamble pays off. By opening the film at the MBE ceremony, by showing us that John eventually reaches a place of recognition and respect, Jones doesn't relieve the tension, he compounds it. Every act of cruelty we witness after that opening carries a double edge. This didn't have to happen. If one teacher had been curious instead of punitive, if one doctor had made the connection sooner, if his mother had chosen confusion over control, every door that closed on John was closed by ignorance, not inevitability. And knowing that he eventually makes it through doesn't make the journey lighter, it makes the unnecessary suffering heavier. The film finds its structural backbone in two characters who function less as people and more as philosophical pivots. Dottie Achenbach, a mental health nurse, played with quiet authority by Maxine Peake, is the first person in John's adult life who separates the condition from the man. She doesn't try to fix his Tourette's. She doesn't pity him. She simply treats him as a complete person, and that act alone begins to undo years of internalized shame. Dottie doesn't get much screen time, but she doesn't need it. Her function is precise. She's the crack in the wall that lets light back in.
Tommy Trotter goes further. Peter Mullen plays him as a man who's lived long enough to know that most problems are problems of framing, not fact. Tommy gives John a job at a community center, which matters. But what matters more is the idea Tommy introduces. The problem isn't your Tourette's. The problem is that people don't know enough about Tourette's. That single reframe changes the entire trajectory of John's life. It shifts his self-concept from victim to advocate, from someone who needs to be tolerated to someone who has something to teach. Tommy's death is handled with the restraint the film earns. John visits him at home and finds him on the floor. There's no dramatic collapse, no orchestral swell. The camera holds, and the audience understands that what just ended wasn't just a friendship, it was a mentorship. And what follows isn't grief in the traditional cinematic sense, it's continuation. John doesn't fall apart, he gets promoted. He meets a child with Tourette's and begins doing what Tommy did for him, reframing the narrative for someone else. The philosophy survives the philosopher.
That's clean, psychologically honest storytelling.
The film's set pieces work because they function as psychological pressure tests rather than plot devices. When John goes to a nightclub for the first time, the scene isn't played for comedy or tragedy. It's played for inevitability. He dances. He enjoys himself. A tic causes him to knock someone's drink over, and within seconds the situation escalates into a fight. He's arrested. He's charged with assault. And at trial, when he's asked to take the oath, he involuntarily swears at the judge and is removed from the stand before he can speak. The system, designed to assess behavior and assign responsibility, has no framework for a body that doesn't obey its owner. Tommy's testimony saves him, drawing a comparison so simple it's devastating. If a blind man had spilled that drink, nobody would have pressed charges.
Then there's the library scene. Robert Aramayo, in a performance that earned him a BAFTA over Leonardo DiCaprio and Timothée Chalamet, plays this moment with nothing but physical presence. A library is a space built on one rule: silence. For John, it's the most hostile environment imaginable, and the scene shows him walking in anyway. No dialogue, no narration, just a man choosing to exist in a space that should reject him. Aramayo's performance throughout the film is technically remarkable. The tics are precise and physically demanding, but this scene is where the emotional precision peaks. It's a portrait of courage that never announces itself as courage. And then the film makes its one mistake. Heather Davidson, John's mother, has been built across the entire runtime as a woman whose response to her son's condition was withdrawal and control. Not cruelty in the dramatic sense, not a villain, but a parent who chose self-protection over connection. The film earns this, slowly and carefully. Every scene between them carries the quiet tension of unresolved harm. And then, in a single scene near the end, Heather apologizes. She softens. The wall comes down. And decades of emotional damage are resolved in what feels like a screenwriting convenience rather than a psychological inevitability. Here's the problem. It might have happened exactly this way in real life. But in cinema, truth isn't the standard. Emotional logic is. And the emotional logic of John Davidson, as this film has constructed him, demands something harder. This is a man who learned through Tommy that acceptance is demonstrated through action, not declared through words. His entire philosophy, the one the film has spent 90 minutes building, is that understanding requires effort, not gestures. A single apology from the person who caused his deepest wound contradicts the very framework the film established. A psychologically consistent version of this moment would look different. The apology still happens, Heather still says the words, but the camera stays on John's face long enough for the audience to feel the gap between hearing and accepting. Then, instead of reconciliation, the film gives us proximity, mother and son in the same room. Not speaking, not touching, but present. That's what forgiveness looks like for someone whose core wound is separation. Not a hug, but the willingness to stay. And the MBE scene lands differently with that weight intact. John isn't standing before the Queen as a man who's been made whole. He's standing there as a man still carrying something. And paradoxically, that makes the achievement more meaningful, because it means he arrived without the one thing most people think they need first, the approval of the person who hurt them most. What happened at the BAFTAs proved the film's thesis in real time. The man whose life story is about being misunderstood sat in an audience full of people who had just watched a film about understanding and was misunderstood again. He left the ceremony early, overwhelmed, mortified by the very symptoms the film spent 2 hours humanizing. That's not irony. That's the film's argument, still being made after the credits rolled, in a room full of people who should have already heard it. I swear flinched from the idea that some wounds stay open. It reached for closure, where the character's psychology pointed toward endurance. But the real story didn't flinch. And maybe that's what makes this film matter more than its ending. The truth it almost told is still being lived, still being misunderstood, still waiting for the world to catch up. If you think character logic matters more than comfortable endings, this is where those conversations happen. Subscribe, and we'll keep pulling the thread.